Welcome to the Wallace Center webinar, HUFED Year 2 RFA process. My name is Jeff Farbman from the Wallace Center at Remark International. We hope this webinar will focus your understanding for the type of program that's a great fit with the HUFED Center. We also hope that you'll come with your questions. We've tried to leave as much time as possible to answer your direct questions. There are a lot of you out there though, so we may not be able to get to them all, so ask your questions early. Let me give you a very brief tech orientation so you can get the most out of your time with us today. Your webinar screen should look something like this with the slide presentation over here on the left and the control panel on the right. Note that if you can't see your control panel on the right, click the bright orange arrow button right on the far extreme right-hand side of your screen to expand it. Also, over in the control panels box is the questions box. So make sure that you can see that control panel. This is how you will communicate with us. You are muted. So this is how you communicate with us. The webinar will be archived on the HUFED website, hufed.org. So if you want to share with a colleague who isn't able to make it, that's a good way to do it. And I want to encourage you to complete our post-webinar survey. It'll take just a minute. It'll pop right up after the end of the webinar, and it really helps us to continue to improve our outreach. So I will return to moderate the question and answer section, but now let me introduce the director of the Wallace Center at Remark International, Dr. John Fisk, for a formal welcome to you all.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello, everyone. It's really good to have you on the line for this webinar. We're excited about being able to offer Year 2 grants and technical assistance. Let me just first say that the purpose of today's webinar is to provide a brief overview of the RFA, which I think most of you have seen over email or on our website. We also want to spend a good bit of time today responding to your particular questions and provide guidance to those of you that are going to be submitting letters of interest. These letters of interest, by the way, are due Friday, January 14th by 4 p.m. Eastern. So before we jump into the description of the program, let me say a quick word about the Wallace Center. The Wallace Center at Remark International has been a leading organization in the movement for a more sustainable and equitable food system for over 25 years. Today, the center supports entrepreneurs, communities, and others as they build a new 21st century food system that's healthier for people, healthier for the environment, and healthier for our economy. We serve a growing community of civic, business, and philanthropic organizations involved in building a new food system in the U.S. Our focus has been on systems change, with particular attention to using market forces to drive that change. We often work at the national level, but we like to have an emphasis on advancing regional, collaborative efforts around the country to move good food. What we call good food is healthy, green, fair, and affordable. And we want to move beyond the direct marketing realm, which we know is important, to also reach into the more scaled up and wholesale channels. The Wallace Center is part of Remark International, a nonprofit organization that works with people in more than 65 countries around the world to empower the disadvantaged, increase economic opportunities, and sustain natural resources. So I think from that brief description you can see that the Hue Fed Center is consistent with the overall emphasis of Wallace Center. Hue Fed's particular distinction is the use of a market-based approach to addressing the food needs of underserved communities. The Hue Fed Center does grant making as well as technical assistance to support food enterprise development in communities. There's growing innovation in this area across the country, and it's a fairly new approach, and we're very early on. And so part of the program is that we want to see the innovation out there, and we want to be able to learn from that and to provide those models back out to everyone. This is only the second year of the program, and it's fairly unique in its emphasis. So with that, let me introduce you to the Wallace Hue Fed Center staff. First, Michelle Muldoon, who's the program manager for Hue Fed, and she'll be telling you a lot more about the RFA process today here in a minute. Christy Kwan is the Hue Fed program coordinator, and she'll also be available on the call to help answer questions. And Jeff Farbman, whom you already heard from, is our communications manager, and he'll actually moderate the Q&A later today. But now let me turn it over to Michelle, who will provide an overview of the RFA, and then we'll follow up with that Q&A session. Michelle?
Thank you, John, and thank you all for taking the time to attend this webinar and for all of the wonderful work you're doing to help those less fortunate. Just as an opening remark, I want to let everybody know that we've got 225 attendees and counting. We've got people from a real broad variety of backgrounds, including, nonprofit, for-profit, just from all different backgrounds. So I'll try to find a common language that, relates to everybody, but it would help if you filled out the poll that Jeff had just mentioned so that we can further tailor and make sure this is the best use of your time by us knowing who all is on the call and what you represent and what you're interested in. So take a look at the poll. The purpose of the webinar, we've been doing a series of outreach workshops around the country, and the purpose of the webinar is to kind of mimic that outreach workshop process, and the goal of that is to really get out there and truly reach those who are truly, underserved communities, representing underserved communities who've been historically excluded or traditionally disadvantaged, whatever you want to call it, but we're making more of an emphasis and, putting extra work into making sure that those who are representing underserved communities actually know about the grant opportunity and then furthermore have the fairest chance of applying for a grant. So in this webinar, we'll be, really putting the emphasis on that, and especially people who are new to grants in general and grants processes. And today we'll discuss the request for application process and the timeline. We'll discuss what we fund, what we don't, what makes a successful application, and then give you some tools and resources and examples of, innovative models and approaches. And then we'll do some question and answer with the staff. I plan to talk, maybe 15 minutes, and then the rest, hopefully, we'll open up the questions and be available to your questions, whether they're technical or process-oriented. Let me remind you that letters of interest are due by Friday, January 14th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So the webinar objectives, what I'm hoping that all of you in this webinar will get out of this by the end of this webinar is to be able to determine if the Hue Fed grant opportunity is a good fit for your work. 2, determine which type of grant you should apply for. 3, learn about innovative models and ideas for healthy food access and getting healthy food to underserved consumers. 4, walk away with tips and tools and resources for a successful application or letter of interest. And 5, get answers to some of your technical and grant preparation questions. Just real quickly, the RFA process, request for application process this year, 2011, starts with the letters of interest, which is due January 14th. We're looking at January, February, where we review and we select those finalists, and we invite those finalists to submit a full proposal, which would be due in March, and then we have a review process of that, and then the final awards get selected, hopefully by early April. That's the timeline that we're targeting. There's 3 kinds of grants that applicants can apply for, and they're very different. And the one that, they're kind of different. And the reason I want to emphasize the grant types is we want to make sure that you take a look at what your proposed enterprise is, your proposed project, and really take a good look at it and realistically see where it may fit into these categories, because we don't want to have somebody taking the time to apply and then actually applying for possibly the wrong kind of grant. So the 3 kinds of grants we have are small enterprise grants up to $25,000, and these are really smaller in scope, could be capital improvements. These are for projects and enterprises that you already know what you need. There's no more research that needs to be done, no more surveying, at least not in a large sense. Large enterprises are multi-year, so in this case, a 2-year program. They have multiple objectives. They're usually larger in scope, and usually the program enterprise project is already established, has kind of a track record, and has a business plan. And then feasibility study are for, those of you who need to do more research, whether it's consumer research or market research, and you need to do some more analyses to know exactly what approach you should take. That would be feasibility study. So it's important to know sort of where each grant fits into the national strategy, just to know, because it's very important that applicants fit into not only the Hue Fed goals and objectives, but then also feed into the national and federal priorities around food access and healthy food for underserved communities. So let me just give a little bit of context. This was part of the Farm Bill in 2008. Hue Fed Center was created. Remark International was awarded the grant to manage this entity and creating enterprises around the country. The Obama administration is putting a lot of emphasis on child nutrition. The First Lady has the Let's Move program. The child nutrition was reauthorized this year. And, I don't need to talk about the trends and the priorities in terms of diet-related disease. I'm sure everybody on this webinar knows about that. And then there's, the cost of health care is starting to come to the surface, at least, and come to national attention as far as, needing to do something preventative about that. And then local regional supply chain is starting to be of interest to consumers and consumer preferences for healthier food options. And then, as John had mentioned, the Hue Fed Center vision and mission is really to address specifically the food access gaps, barriers, bottlenecks, deficits that prevent that healthy food from getting to an underserved consumer. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Okay, so the goals and objectives, this is also extremely important. I know it's in the RFA guidelines, but I'm going to repeat them all here because the more you understand the goals and objectives and you can prove and demonstrate that you will be, meeting these goals and objectives, and more than a few, the more the better, the stronger application you'll have. So the goal of the program is 1, improved food access, 2, increased farmer opportunity and income, 3, market-based change, approach to food insecurity, 4, sharing and learning. Objectives is grant making and technical assistance. What we're doing is providing grants and TA to 1, reduce the supply chain bottlenecks contributing to food insecurity, so those gaps and barriers I talked about. 2, increased healthy local food into mainstream distribution channels, so we're looking at a larger scale reaching more people rather than the direct marketing approach. 3, increased number of retail sites marketing healthy food. 4, increased availability and volume of healthy food in current existing retail. So our approach, i.e. what we fund, what we're looking for, is obviously it has to start with the consumers. There must absolutely be a demonstrated need. You've got to have credible data backing it, whether it's a food desert according to USDA or it's a census poverty statistic. You should know your audience and know why they are underserved and know what the food access problems are and be able to articulate that to us with, credible resources. And we are also looking at, making sure that the approach starts with the consumer and specifically consumer behavior, because you have to meet people where they are and then go from there. So you can't expect to just, for example, in another program possibly, maybe just start a farmer's market and expect people to just start immediately buying at the farmer's market when they've never maybe cooked from scratch, with a raw product before. So really understanding who that target consumer is that you're working with. Definitely have to, innovation comes from, identifying problems and finding a creative solution to that problem that nobody else has tried or maybe tried and not succeeded. So we really want to look at funding specific gaps, barriers, bottlenecks to, that if resolved would open up the flow of healthy food. Again, looking at creative innovation, out-of-the-box thinking, alternative food marketing and distribution approaches, and again, the market-based change in social enterprise, market-based, consumer-centered approach for social change, using business principles, marketing principles for social change. It's got to be economically sustainable. When the grant is over, will the program be over? Will the enterprise end? How are you going to keep that going? A systems approach is very important. How do you fit in to the larger food system? How does your proposed solution fit into the larger food supply chain, and who will benefit and how will they benefit, down the supply chain, up the supply chain, and so forth. And also looking at it from a systems approach in terms of partners. Is your partnership multi-stakeholder, cross-functional? Do you have everybody that it takes at the table, or the strongest team possible to make this a success? Is there a capacity that's missing at that table that you need to find that partner to fill? And then we are looking at urban and urban-rural linkages in terms of audience. What we don't fund is, first of all, we don't fund individual people. We don't fund individuals. We're also not funding food policy or advocacy directly. We're hoping that, you know, the results of our program could then impact food policy, but we're not directly funding any kind of advocacy. We're not funding community organizing in the kind of advocacy sense. We're not directly funding nutrition education, and I'll talk more about this later. Food donations, community gardens that are really just about, you know, youth empowerment and education of subsistence. Projects that don't reach underserved consumers within the life of the program we can't fund because we've got to show, you know, that we're trying some innovative strategies that are going to have an immediate short to midterm impact on the problem at hand. And obviously, if the applications don't meet the objectives, or the less objectives they meet, the weaker the application will be. And also, finally, applications that don't fit the grant type. For example, somebody applying for a large enterprise grant who really hasn't started, you know, gotten anything off the ground, and they really don't have a business plan per se yet. You know, so that would be probably, you know, either a small enterprise or a feasibility study, depending on how much planning and research they have behind them. You know, so that's just an example of the grant type, and I can answer more questions about that later. Some examples from year one. It's really important to know that this is an open competition and it's highly competitive. The purpose of this outreach is to provide everybody with the fairest possible chance of applying, but without compromising the open, you know, competitive nature of this the grant process. So in year one, we had 538 letters of interest. 47 full applications were selected out of that who submitted full proposals, and then 13 awards were ultimately made. You know, it demonstrates that there is a great need out there, and there were a lot of great ideas, and you know, we just didn't have the funds to fund all of them. And so, you know, we're doing what we can at our level to make connections and that sort of thing, to identify other resources that are complementary to the program. So the categories of the enterprises that we selected in year one are business, social enterprise incubation, value chain support, so that's supply chain, food value chain, value-based value chain, whatever you want to call it, kind of support, you know, for those missing links in the supply chain, or the relationships in the supply chain. Equipment purchases, capacity at the retail level, so, you know, marketing capacity, you know, food processing capacity, package handling capacity, and then food safety certification and labeling in order to scale up was another area that we funded. Some proposal tips briefly, you know, keep it really concise and direct. You know, from our perspective, you know, our review panel is reviewing, you know, dozens and dozens or hundreds of pages, and, you know, the more direct and concise and articulate you can be, you know, and it doesn't have to be fancy language, just be really direct. This is our problem, this is our solution, and, you know, this is why it's going to work. So talk about that, you know, the problem, your solutions, and why you're uniquely positioned to address it. Tell us exactly what you want to do and how the funding is going to be used. You may have a great idea, but we walk away feeling like we don't know exactly how it's going to work. You know, we can't get a mental picture about how it's going to happen, though it kind of sounds like a good idea. Tell us who your partners are going to be and how that is sort of cross-functional or multidimensional, how they're going to be complementary to the work that you're doing and make you stronger. Clearly tell us how it's market-based and how it's going to reach underserved communities, and use relevant data to demonstrate the need. We have all kinds of resources on our website to direct you to statistics and data and all that kind of stuff, and we're also there to help if you need help accessing that data. And then please read and follow the instructions, especially formatting guidelines and page limits, because there's nothing more tragic than having someone eliminated because they used the wrong font or they went over the page limit. So really just be very careful about that, very, very careful. Okay, If you take nothing away from this webinar, take this one slide with you and really think about it when you're applying. You want to ask yourself these 4 questions. 1, where will you focus? Who is underserved in your geographic area? Describe and define the food access issue and its symptoms. 2, what are the top 3 barriers or obstacles preventing these communities from eating healthy food, and how will you address one or all of these, so the problems and solutions? 3, how is your project unique? Who else is doing it, and how will you do it better? And then return on investment. If we fund $1, what's going to be generated out of that, whether it's, you know, an economic impact or some kind of other quantifiable or qualitative impact. 4, how are you taking the systems approach that I mentioned before? Who are your partners? So you can find additional help on our website, HUFED.org. We have a HUFED mailbox, HUFED@winrock.org. We've got our hotline, 703-531-8810. And here, for those of you that can see the slideshow, we have just a few examples here of the kinds of resources that are out there. We've got, you know, the Child Obesity Task Force report to the President that was done in 2010. There's the Food Desert Study and the USDA Food Atlas done by the Economic Research Service at USDA. There's the U.S. Census stuff. There's Let's Move, labor statistics. There's Health and Human Services. All of these have great data, great content, great information, already done extensive research that you can look at for your specific situation. So just to get things started, because again we want to make sure that we get to your questions and we spend most of the time on your questions here, just to get that thinking going, we're going to start with some of our frequently asked questions, just a couple examples, and then we're going to open it up to the audience to then, you know, ask your specific questions. This question comes in a lot. Is the opportunity open to true social enterprise, that is for-profit organizations working with the triple bottom line? So the answer to that is yes, for-profit entities are eligible and should consider applying. And, you know, look at the additional resources on grant writing, see page 14 of the RFA guidelines. Another question, will there be other requests in 2011? And the answer is no. We have an annual process, and, you know, again, this is an open competition, so we've got a pretty rigid process, and we've got to make sure it's, you know, documented and fair and all of that. So we have an annual process, and the dates are as they are. We won't be doing it again this year. The question about, you know, if I'm located in Hawaii or Alaska, or if I'm, you know, are there certain biases, or, you know, is there an advantage or disadvantage of where I'm at? And basically, no, it's the whole entire United States. There's no geographic disadvantage or advantage. We're just looking for high quality, innovative applicants from anywhere in the United States that meet the requirements of the grant guidelines and the goals and objectives of our grant. Question, should I apply for an enterprise grant or a feasibility study? The answer is, if you need to conduct more research, market analyses, other types of planning, please consider applying for a feasibility study, because your chances will be better of getting awarded. If you're already to implement at the time of the award, you'll want to consider applying for an enterprise grant. That means you've already done some surveying, you've got the research, you've got the, you know this is, you know, has a great shot of working, and, you know, maybe you've got a business plan drafted, that kind of thing, then you want to consider enterprise grant. Question, if I'm submitting an application but another organization has asked me to be a collaborator on a separate Hue Fed application, is this okay? And the answer is yes. Organizations may partner with other organizations. Please make sure both applications are distinct enterprises, and we will not accept duplicate projects submitted under 2 different organization names. So we now open up the questions to all of you on the line. There's 270 people now on the webinar, so we'll do our best to get to the questions. We are, however, available. You know, through our hotline, through the email, through our website, and we'll be happy to, you know, respond in that way if we don't get to your question today.
Well, this is Jeff. Thank you, Michelle. That was great. There's been several questions about if the presentation will be available or if a recording of the webinar will be available. And the answer is yes to both. On HUFED.org, that website up there, right on your screen, we are recording the webinar, and we will post all of the slides up there as well. So you don't have to be furiously taking notes. The only notes you need is HUFED.org. John, let me start with a question for you. It's actually a combination of two questions. Kim asked a very good question, a fundamental question. She asked you to define market-based. And related, Brian asks that about that the fact that the program must be sustainable after the grant period is over, but does the organization have to be profitable?
Right. A couple of good questions in core to what we're trying to do here. When we say market-based, what that means is that we're utilizing the draw of the market to create a change. So if we're going to increase food access for people, it's not driven by a subsidy, it's not driven by a donation or volunteerism. There may be that part of it, that may be part of the overall plan, but just as important, if not overriding the important, is some kind of a revenue stream, some kind of a market mechanism that provides money into the system that rewards the grower, maybe rewards any of the players along the supply chain as needed. Because the fundamental assumption behind this program is that in order to be truly effective and to have lasting impact, we're going to need to utilize that market force to achieve these goals. We've spent many years in this country trying to do it essentially without it, and it hasn't fully worked, and it gets more and more expensive. On the other hand, the market itself in many ways has failed many of the populations, and so it puts us between a rock and a hard place in a sense. So one of our assumptions under the program is that we probably won't achieve all of this with a market piece, but we know we won't achieve success if we don't actually include a market piece. And so whatever we're asking people to propose, and this kind of gets to the second part of the question that you asked, Jeff, that came in, was that if what we're interested in funding are enterprises. And so when we say sustainability, we say that they're going to be in place afterwards, and they're not going to rely fully upon donation or grants. They're going to rely, hopefully, in very large part, on a revenue-generating stream that allows it to continue and reward actors in that project. So, and the other dimension to that is that this is a fairly short time frame. 1, 2, 3, 4 years is a very short time frame for any enterprise, and so we don't expect the projects or the enterprises to be profitable. We expect them to have a plan for profitability and to be tracking on that plan, which is a very which is the way businesses look at it and the way banks and such will look at it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, John. A related sort of industry question, Michelle. David asks, what do you mean by value chain support?
Okay, I'll try to be brief here because this could go on a long time and could be a whole academic study, but the long and short of it is, we're looking at the food supply chain from producer, even pre-production, on to consumer and consumption of the product. And that whole series of events that has to occur and all those links in between, we're looking at it, however, from a not just supply chain. Traditionally it's kind of extractive and it goes in one direction, where a product gets to the end consumer and it doesn't really, the wealth and equity doesn't really go back. So we're looking at a food supply chain, food value chain that is values-driven, values-based, where there's a fairness and there's an equity to that, and where there's more sharing of the wealth and there's relationships, and it's based on trust between buyer and producer, and that sort of thing. John, do you want to add to that? Okay, I think that should be pretty sufficient. If I'll jump back in if I think of anything additional.
Great. Christy, there's a question about how many feasibility studies we funded for the first year of Hue Fed Center?
In year one, we funded 4 feasibility studies.
Okay, thanks. Michelle, can a strategic plan for a nonprofit substitute for the business plan? So strategic plan for a nonprofit versus a business plan for the business.
I would say yes. I mean, there's a lot of different versions of strategic plans out there. I mean, different templates and models that people use. But, I mean, the general thing is, what's the overall strategy and how you're going to make it happen? What are your timelines? What are your benchmarks? That sort of thing. Who's involved? I mean, I think that there's a lot of similarities between the two, so I would say yes.
And this is John. I will jump in on this one, Michelle. Thank you.
Okay.
That I think the distinction is that, again, you've got what we're looking for is something with a revenue generation that has a business angle to it. So if your strategic plan for your organization includes that, then I think it qualifies. If it doesn't, then you're missing an essential component that this program is interested in, that enterprise aspect of the project.
Thanks, John.
Okay, and John, can I ask you another question? Does each proposal have to match up with every Hue Fed goal, or if one particular goal is very well developed, does that qualify?
No, I think some of the goals are exclusive. For example, you can focus more on supply chain and farmer opportunity and not necessarily be involved in retail. Okay, but on the other hand, some of them are integrated, such as increasing access for those that currently have limited access, and it being an enterprise focus. And so there are some pieces to this that Michelle outlined very clearly that are essential, and you want to make sure you have those. But I do think that you can focus within the goal area and not hit them all. So that's the short answer.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Michelle, on the feasibility studies, Lucia asks, what outcomes are you interested in, since you're not actually starting a business, you're just doing a feasibility study? So what are reasonable outcomes for a feasibility study?
A feasibility study, I mean, a reasonable outcome would be, yes, we now know it's a great idea, or no, it's not going to work this way, and we would have to do X, Y, and Z to make it work. So the research, should in and of itself then determine if it's a viable, realistic activity and what it would involve, and then, feed into or possibly be the blueprint for your business plan or marketing strategy.
Okay. I want to also note to our audience, keep your eye on the questions box there. Christy beside me here is furiously typing lots of answers to questions in written form. So there's these verbal Q&A, but also keep an eye on the written. And if you miss it, we will post these written questions and answers as well on the HUFED.org website. John, a very specific question: are co-op food markets eligible for Hue Fed?
Yes, I mean, co-ops are a legal form, a for-profit legal form, so they're definitely qualify. I think, again, you got to get down to the basics. Is it serving the audience that this program's focused on serving? That's probably the biggest one, because those two essential components, again, are a market-based program and meeting increasing food access.
Okay, great. And now, Michelle, Amy says that you mentioned that K-12 schools can apply. What kind of programs would you envision them running in order to win an award? Amy has a description. Would you like me to just read the description of her program?
I think I read it. Okay. I saw it, yeah. First of all, subsidized programs are okay. I didn't mention that earlier, but we've gone back and forth on this. There is an economic sustainability component to this, so we would like to see this generating income and revenue and being self-sustaining. But if you're looking at, SNAP, WIC being kind of the currency to purchase healthier food, then that's okay, provided that it's, you know, it's still looking at it from a market-based approach, a food value chain approach, and it's getting healthier food out to end consumers. In a school situation, what we would look for is you know, a good existing relationship with the food service director and making sure that you're really reaching underserved schools. So you may be doing a farm to school project already, but it's really not in the area that, you know, you're targeting, and you want to also make sure that you can have some impacts in the immediate and short term, i.e. within the next, you know, 2 years if you were to apply for a large enterprise grant, and 1 year if you were to apply for a small enterprise grant.
Claire asks where on the website is access to the resource data that we mentioned. Christy, you want to point her in the right direction?
The data is actually available. If you look on page 15 of our RFA guidelines, the very last page, there are some resources for providing some supporting data. And because data in terms of understanding food access has not really been standardized across the country, it's more up to you to find the most appropriate data for your region, whether that could be the Census American Community Survey 3-year estimates. That would work for us if you can find the most appropriate data. You can also check out the USDA Food Atlas. There's more information about grocery stores or SNAP or WIC in your community. Some other sources that we have seen that have come through is maybe your local planning commission or planning agency has done a study where they've actually have some hard data and facts. What would be most helpful when you present your data in your LOI is if you present your regional or local data as compared to the national average. That would be the most helpful to our reviewers to understand the need in your region. If you have more questions concerning about specific data or you're unsure of where to gather more data, feel free to email or call the hotline where I can better assist you with more detailed answers.
Great. John, Robert has a pretty specific question, but I think it's worthwhile reading it out. Gleaners Food Bank of Indiana is partnering with several private and public stakeholders on an 8-acre organic garden on property owned by the city of Indianapolis, designed to provide fresh produce to underserved communities in the city. Would a proposal to provide expanded capacity to distribute this produce to underserved communities be a good fit for a 2-year large enterprise grant?
Right. So maybe. The question is maybe, and I think it's an interesting question because I think it's illustrative for a number of things. Some of the questions I would ask myself if I was going to submit, I would say, am I actually distributing a significant quantity of product? Or is the garden really more of a community center, more of a learning opportunity, or a youth garden? So if this is really about calories and nutrition, then I think that's a plus. If the product is being bought and sold, again, if it's a revenue, if it's a relationship that it partially includes revenue to some significant level, then I think that's a plus. If it isn't, you know, then it's really not a fit for this program. Last year we received many letters of interest that were focused on some type of garden or another, and none of them got funded because they all didn't have those components. And so I think you really 8 acres is a good amount of area. You can grow quite a bit of product. But if it's going to be eventually relying on donations and philanthropy to keep it going and to pay everybody, or if it's really not a significant quantity of product, then I think you got to think twice.
Okay. Very specific, is a budget required in a letter of interest?
A detailed budget is not required during the letter of interest stage. During the full proposal stage, we'll request a full detailed budget with different line items for you to basically fill out your request and to include a budget narrative. For the letter of interest, we recommend that you at least provide some sort of snapshot of how you intend to use the funds so that the reviewers have a better understanding of how the funds fit with your enterprise or feasibility concept.
And we are asking for for them to tell us exactly how much they're requesting.
Okay. Michelle, Molly asks if Hue Fed grant can be used for workforce development, such as farmer training, if it includes outreach to underserved communities.
I think the question you have to ask yourself, because some of the questions that are coming in, there's not a black or white yes or no. I think it depends on if you're meeting the objectives of the Hue Fed program overall, and you are reaching underserved communities in the end, and if you've identified a gap that's missing and that those producers through that capacity training would then be able to fill, that would then open up the flow, that would then get healthier food to underserved communities, then that would work. So you just have to ask yourself how it's all coming together, the value chain and the underserved consumers.
Okay. Maybe John and Michelle, you both want to sort of take a pass at this. How do you distinguish between a small enterprise and a large enterprise grant? And maybe if you both address it, you'll be able to sort of take different cuts at it, and people, because it is confusing. So John, you wanna take a whack at it first?
Okay, sure. One of the simple tests that I try to use is a small enterprise grant can be used for something that's already established that wants to either expand or reinforce or take to the next level. It can also be used for something that maybe has a feasibility study and a business plan but hasn't been implemented yet. So it's early on the development stage, but it's definitely an implementation phase that's being funded. So it can be a startup. Whereas the larger enterprise grants, we've leaned away from using those for startups, for things that don't exist yet to be created anew. We've tended to use those to expand existing programs that have shown effectiveness to reach more people or to open up stronger supply chains to reinforce the entire pressure. Now that doesn't mean there aren't going to be exceptions, or there may not already be exceptions in what we've funded, but that's kind of my general rule of thumb. That the risk is higher with the large one, therefore we want to reduce the risk by having some establishment behind it already.
And Michelle, you want to give your take on large versus small?
Yeah, I mean, I think just echoing what John said, I think that you want to have a track record if you're applying for a large enterprise grant. It doesn't mean you have to have been around for 10 years, but just having a track record, at least having been through a growing season, having a business plan or some kind of a written plan, having the partnerships already in place, and large enterprise grants tend to be multiple objectives, working with different areas of the supply chain, whereas a small enterprise might just be a finite, specific, here's the gap in the supply chain and this is how we're going to address it.
Okay, good. And another one for you, John. Can the grant be used for food assessment studies, including food access for consumers?
Yeah, I think it can be, and I would recommend a feasibility level study. Again, you got to be consistent with this program. You got to say, what are we looking at the feasibility of? Are we just assessing and saying, do we have a food desert, for example? Do we have limited access? And what are the conditions around that? There's no enterprise there. There's no solution being proposed. If the feasibility study says, we want to do our assessment and then do the feasibility of a solution that we envision, what are the costs of that? How many people are we going to reach? What's it going to take to be successful? That's the fuller picture that would be more probable, would be more potential for success with us.
Michelle, Colleen asks, we have existing relationships with the systems we're trying to assist and change, i.e. other distributors, school systems, etc. We're looking to help increase the amount we're able to do. Is this applicable to increase the impact of our existing efforts?
I would say most definitely yes. I think it's our fourth objective to, beef up existing retail operations or improve or enhance or scale up somehow, so I would say yes.
Okay, and another question for you, Michelle, from Lonnie. How underserved must consumer communities be to meet your guidelines? Do they have to be really hungry, very low income, more than a certain distance from a store in a food desert?
That's a very good question, and I think that there are a lot of definitions out there. The Food Desert Study and the Food Atlas from USDA, looks at proximity to a grocery store, but, that doesn't work because you don't take into account smaller convenience stores and really small grocery stores or mom and pops and corner stores. So it's really up to you to tell us how you define underserved and how these people are underserved. And the bottom line is that they don't have healthy food access, and there is subsequent problems because of that, whether it be hunger or diabetes or obesity, heart disease, that kind of thing. So that's why we provide all of the resources so that you can look up and really analyze what's going on in your region so that you can come up with your own definitions.
And would it be fair to underscore the data-based arguments? In other words, present your argument using accepted data sets.
Yeah, and I think I had mentioned that earlier, that you want to make sure you have credible resources, so we provide some examples of that. If you have on-the-ground research and information and statistics that you can cite, please do include those as well. But really the underserved communities are, you're looking at some of the poorest of the poor, low income, possibly, lack of, support resources, that sort of thing. In the legislation, there's an emphasis on reaching out to African Americans, Hispanic, American Indian, limited resource producers and vendors, low income. So, it's just really dependent. So we have everything from, Hispanic corner store to, Appalachia rural. So it's, it just really depends on how, you define it, and that the need is there, that you have a solution, and that it could possibly, it could work, and that there's potential.
Mm-hmm. Okay. John, one of the Hue Fed stated objectives is breaking into mainstream distribution channels. Does that mean that there's no interest, or a direct-to-consumer model would likely not be a successful candidate?
Again, I think this is a good question because it kind of gets to the heart of things. I think a direct-to-consumer model is eligible and can be. In fact, I think we funded some last year, more around our incubation, the ones that kind of fell in the incubation category. But some of the things that I would want to see if we had a direct-to-consumer model would be, are we getting some scale? Are we getting, how many consumers are we getting to? How frequently? What kind of a nutritional impact is possible? One of the farmers markets are terrific, and I love them to no end, but one of the challenges is they're relatively infrequently and often seasonal. Now, not always, but it's hard for people to get what they need, whereas if you've got a retail situation that's always available, or a direct-to-consumer situation that's more frequent, and that they've addressed the distribution issues effectively for the target audience, then I think it can be highly effective. So, for example, it makes me think of some of the multi-farm CSA programs that are distributing effectively into urban areas. Those can be quite effective. So, yes.
Okay. Christy, one for you. If you're awarded this year, are you able to submit another application the following year? In other words, how frequently can you submit a grant? That's from Michelle.
If you submit a feasibility for this year and the feasibility study that was favorable and towards moving forward with implementation, and if timing is right, you are eligible to submit for an application during our third call for proposals in 2012 to submit for a small or large enterprise grant. But that's also depending if your feasibility study is does give you a favorable decision to move forward, and if the timing is right with the announcement of the RFA in 2012.
Okay. John, can a market analysis of those barriers associated with providing good food be done in conjunction with setting up a trial distribution sites, such as part of a feasibility study? This is from Christina.
So I think Christina's asking, can you do your feasibility while you're piloting?
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's how I interpret it too.
Yeah. Yes, you can. I think that could work quite well, because then and it kind of depends on what you're doing, and can you do them sequentially effectively. But yes, I think one of our current grantees is actually doing that already. So, and we kind of thought that's nice, because we're getting almost a double bang for the buck. You're kind of getting some one-year data, but you're also getting a more thought-out feasibility / business plan. So I think it can be positive.
Great. Good. Debbie asks what type of TA HUFED will be providing.
To the awarded grants, we have funding available to provide technical assistance, whether directly or through partnerships and consultants from around the country. The technical assistance can vary. It can be, we need help specifically around food handling, or applying for a food, a permit. I'm kind of blanking right now.
Repeat the question, Jeff.
Misty.
I've deleted it off my my control panel here.
It's the kind of TA that's available. It's a needs-based thing. It's it's based on what possible capacity gap there may still be in the the project that you're proposing, and sometimes you may not even know that during the proposal process, and we may identify that together, which is what happened with some of our year one grants. They did not think they needed technical assistance, but as we got out there and we did site visits and we did some, we got some needs assessment and realized that, oh, okay, they do. So, for example, one of the grantees is looking at getting a consultant to help them beef up their inventory and database so that they can really track their sales and their, inventory and where everything's going and what they have, and what's slated ahead and projections and that kind of thing. So that's an example of that. There could be specific marketing considerations, like like one of the examples may be the retailer or the enterprise markets to a cross-cultural, a lot of different types of consumers, and maybe you're trying to enhance or increase the healthy food purchases of a specific kind of consumer from a specific kind of background. So you would want to have, maybe somebody to help you, provide that that link to that community or that culture, whether it be through, translating languages, Asian, Latino, whether it be translating the needs or the dietary preferences or the food preparation preferences and that kind of thing. And that could also be like part of branding. So those are just a couple of examples, but that's just a flavor for what the TA is about.
Great, thanks. John, Laura asks about a collaboration between a Native Indian tribal council and a nonprofit. If the tribe is the historically disadvantaged community, but the nonprofit has the depth of experience in food security issues, who should apply? Would HUFED respond more favorably to the LOI from the tribe or from the nonprofit, or does it matter?
Right. Again, I think this raises a really critical point for us, in that what we have learned about doing this work, and what we've been, both from doing it as well as from being around others that do grant making, is that things are more sustainable and more effective at actually reaching needs in underserved communities if those underserved communities are an integral part of the project. If they have some decision making, if they're engaged in the design, if they're engaged in the implementation. For a whole variety of reasons, that's the case. And so the question, in a sense, gets at that. So if the danger with the grantee not being the tribe is that there needs to be if it's not that way, they need to have very, very strong bridges to the tribe. There needs to be some shared leadership, perhaps some longer-term relationships. So there needs to be that strong connection that will reassure us that actual needs will get met. And it won't be just from the perspective of, say, those outside the tribe who think they know what the tribe needs. It really needs to come from inside. So if the grant is given inside, and I mean, it can go either way. It's kind of a strategic grant writing question on the one hand. On the other hand, it kind of gets to a core issue. Bottom line is there needs to be representation in decision making to make sure that the funds are actually going to be used to effectively meet the need. That can be done no matter who the grantee is, honestly. It depends on the quality of the relationship and the design of the project.
Michelle, Anthony is familiar with one of our Year 1 grantees, La Cocina, who he says he has a lot of respect for the organization and the work that they do, but is confused if their approach reaches underserved consumers and therefore meets our guidelines. He's thinking of applying for using a similar concept.
Okay, that's a very good question, and I think that, it's important to note that this is very innovative. It's kind of, we are breaking new ground with what we're trying to do, and so, it is not assumed that everybody's, if everybody was marketing perfectly to underserved consumers and they were, eating healthier food, then we wouldn't even have this problem in the first place. But we want to see an attempt already made and a track record already made with underserved communities. And so in the case of La Cocina, we're basically funding a pilot program that's looking at street cart vendors for healthy ethnic food. And so they're not even marketing it as healthy, but they're saying real Mexican food. And so they're substituting ingredients for healthier ingredients and, trying to source locally. So it does still meet some of the objectives of the program in terms of, producers, and then also the vendors are themselves historically disadvantaged. So they are limited resource individuals who get into this food business incubator program. They have a commercial kitchen, and all of that. And so, and it is anticipated that by the end of the program, they will be marketing to underserved consumers. And there's an added dimension to that, which is street cart vendors are relatively new in San Francisco. So they're trying to tread carefully in terms of starting this, and so we're doing a lot of tracking in this year, and then it's anticipated that by the end of the second year, by the end of next year, that we'll have made impacts and be able to specifically say how many underserved consumers were reached. But the two parks that they're going to be located at, these street cart vendors, have citizens that are considered underserved, enjoying the facilities at the parks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good points. Christy, Heidi represents a statewide organization that is a state-registered nonprofit, but not currently a 501c3. Would they be eligible to apply? And also, when is the grant period for the how long is the grant period for the small enterprise projects?
If you're a statewide organization that is a state-registered nonprofit, it should be okay. In the event where either the corporation is, in some cases, a lot of people have been asking if their 501c3 incorporation is still in process and not yet approved by the time grants are awarded, we can also work with you to find a fiscal sponsor that will be responsible for managing the funds and working with you to make sure that the funds can get to you so you can do your work. And in terms of the grant periods, grantees will be selected around early April, so I would imagine shortly thereafter, so probably late spring to early summer is when the grant period will start, and it would go for up to 1 year at a time. If you apply for a 2-year grant, you will be awarded 1 year at a time, contingent on satisfactory performance, and then a renewal for your 2nd year of funds.
Good. John, a combination question for you. Jeffrey and Molly are both asking about creating new physical facilities. Jeffrey wants to know if you can apply for funds for the cost of new facilities associated with the Farm to School program, and Molly wants to know about a new building for a permanent market or retail center in an underserved area.
Right. This is our grant program is relatively small. But if you look at a lot of these physical plant type projects that need infrastructure, they often get quite large. And so, as grant makers, we would see our contribution, we would see it as part of the larger project, but I'm not sure that it would be all that satisfying for us to just have our money put into, say, a cooler or just construction pieces. It's possible. It depends on the vision and the potential impact of the entire project and how well the business plan is put together. So technically the answer is yes, that works. In reality is it's a little more iffy, and we'd want to see a strong business plan and a larger vision if we're just going to limit our funds to, say, construction or physical plant.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Michelle, Dwayne has a question about seeking to support underserved populations that are receiving prepared meals through existing programs such as Head Start and Meals on Wheels. Can the program agency be considered the consumer in a market feasibility study to find local sources of food for those populations?
Okay, I think in this instance, I think that they would be considered more the buyer, and then the end recipient would be the consumer. And we have situations like that. One of our grantees right now, they provide meals to shelters and nonprofits for homeless individuals, but they're purchasing, and right now, like $850,000 worth of produce a year, and they're, have one of their objectives is to increase local purchases, from local regional farms. And so, it's, again, it's that subsidy question and the economic sustainability of that. But if you look at it in terms of a currency, and that it is generating revenue, and that it is something that could be potentially replicated elsewhere to other areas that have Head Start, et cetera, and the programs that you mentioned, it could be viable. But you really have to look at it from that market-based lens, and who is the buyer and who is the consumer, and where's this product coming from.
Okay. Well, Robin has a question, John, for you. Is it a requirement to include local food in the proposal, or is healthy food acceptable?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of times local and regional food is coupled with a lot of these kind of things, and for good reason in a lot of ways. But I don't. It's not essential. If a good case can be made that impact is going to be had and it's not local food, I think that could be competitive. I'm a little torn about it, and I think much of the review team would be a bit torn about it. So in all honesty, because they are coupled, and if you look at one of our goals is around driving regional farm viability. So it could work. I'm not sure how competitive it would be. I guess that's the best I can do.
Okay. Michelle, can collaborators change after the LOI has been submitted with letters from these collaborators? Or perhaps Christy can address that. In other words, can you change gears after your LOI has been submitted?
I mean, we realize that, you know, things are never, change is inevitable, right? So, but ideally, you've thought all of this through, you've anticipated whatever pitfalls, and, you know, if the candidate that you wanted to partner with, you know, has that potential to, if it has the potential to break off, then, you know, you wouldn't want to partner with them in the first place. So, I mean, ideally, we don't want to see that, but of course, you know, every business has to be, you know, flexible and accommodating to the changes that come as part of the reality of economics and life.
Sure. Okay. Again, Michelle, for you, Marcia asks if faith-based organizations are viable candidates for grants.
The answer is yes. I mean, I think that, you know, in some of the areas of our country, and this is something that we, you know, on the staff who, you know, we've gone out and we've been traveling, and in some of the rural areas, you know, sometimes if they don't have access to, if you don't have access to healthy food, or let's put it this way, and often in the rural areas where people will congregate, and the largest number of people congregating on any given day is going to be Sunday at church for, you know, a Christian faith-based institution. So that presents an opportunity to engage, to educate, to, you know, and so a faith-based institution, this would go again with the idea that looking at it from a systems approach. A faith-based institution that's not really doing much beyond a Sunday service may not be that, you know, strong of a candidate, but a faith-based institution, that a church that may be doing community outreach and circle groups, you know, group meetings at people's houses, and they're doing nutrition education and this other kind of thing, you know, that there's a potential there, but you have to demonstrate how it's going to work from a supply chain kind of angle, describe specifically how that's going to work and where the transactions are, and specifically as well how consumers are actually going to buy it or acquire it and actually prepare it, you know, healthfully.
Mm-hmm. John, Christine asks if a grant can be used on a feasibility study on food manufacturing incubator / food innovation center using regional agricultural commodities. She goes on to say that it's a kitchen incubator. The partners are educational institutions, governments, private businesses, farmers, underserved inner city residents, and rural residents.
Mm-hmm. Right, so this, in my mind, this kind of falls into what we call business incubator category, which is a fairly broad category. And so the short answer is yes, that can work. I think the larger answer is that in a lot of what we saw in the past was that there's a great distance between how the money is used at the incubator versus that enterprise. And so I would recommend a fairly direct connection between that particular enterprise and the incubator that it's involved with. And at the same time, there still needs to be, you know, there needs to be a business plan. It's not about just creating the incubator. It's not about the incubator. It's about the enterprise. That's probably the clearest distinction I could make. We're not out there funding incubators per se. We will fund the incubator to improve the performance and capacity of the enterprise. But we're not there to build incubators.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and just to add to that, mm-hmm. the La Cocina example, which is our grantee in San Francisco, you know, they, you know, the two that are pilots, so they're people that have already graduated from the incubator program. They're some of the best, you know, graduates of that program, and they're really interested, and they're the best candidates to be working in this kind of healthy food access program. So we're, again, not funding anything with the food incubator stuff, but they've already been through that whole process and are now ready to, you know, to pilot a viable enterprise.
Okay, Christy, one for you. There's a question about a nonprofit that just formed. Is that a viable grantee?
Yes, as long as your application is aligned with the center's goals and objectives, and that your organization has proved that they have the capacity to carry out the work as promised. If you find out you're in process of applying and awaiting your 501c3 certification status and it's still not there at the time of award, we will work something out to find a fiscal sponsor to work with you as you're awaiting your certification.
Okay, thanks, Christy. Michelle, Jesse asks if they are interested in funding an existing mobile market to expand the capacity of that market through a better vehicle and added sites. Is that program sustainable if it is self-sustaining, although not profitable? So this touches on what we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I think this touches on two things. One is funding an existing business to scale up, expand, improve. That's definitely yes. In terms of economic sustainability, I mean, I think that it is assumed by us here on the staff and the review panel that, a small business has a life cycle from start till profitability, and that profitability does not occur overnight. So the main question that we're looking at is, when the grant ends, are you going to be able to continue doing this? I think that's really the bottom line. But it's not really a cut and dry answer either, but I would say that, at a minimum, demonstrate how when the grant is over that, you'll be able to continue doing what you're doing and you'll continue to be able to impact people and get healthier food to, underserved communities.
John, Barbie asks about accepting a grant proposal from an emergency 24-hour food bank up in Fairbanks, Alaska. She's asking how does she figure out what services that they provide would be most interesting to the Hue Fed Council.
Right. So, the food banks in general kind of fall into that non-enterprise zone. Most of them are driven by donations or grant money. So my first question would be, is there a revenue generating aspect to this that you're interested in having us support? And if so, is it serving the demographic of underserved that we're looking to serve? And if so, can it be reinforced through procurement in a local supply chain? So are you stimulating and increasing opportunity for growers? So, if that's the context that we're talking about, then I think, and if you know what you're doing there, then you may want to look at a small enterprise grant. If it's a concept that you want to build out, again, that has a revenue generating angle to it, I would suggest a feasibility study for that.
Okay, and I'm just going to finish up with this one last question. It's been a long and I hope very useful session. So, Christy, you get the last one. Annie says our project is connected to a much larger collaborative with over 25 organizations. They're not specific partners. Do they all have to submit letters?
I don't think we would need letters of collaboration from all 25 partners. If a lot of the partners are providing the same role as, I can't think of a situation off the top of my head, but if you have a group of collaborators or partners that are doing the same thing, you can write one letter and put the organizations and have whoever from the organization sign that letter. If you find out that you do not have enough time to obtain detailed letters of collaboration from your partners, go ahead and just detail some of their role in your LOI narrative. Just keep in mind that space is kind of tight. We do have a max of 2 or 3 page limit depending on your grant type, but just briefly describe what their role is just so the reviewers have an overall snapshot of what's going on with your proposal.
Okay, thanks Christy, and thanks John, and thanks Michelle. I hope this gives you a better sense of the Hue Fed program and a clearer idea of how your organization's efforts fit into it. Please remember to fill out the survey, which should load in your browser in just a moment when I end the webinar. And the Wallace Hue Fed Center thanks you for your time today and wishes you good luck on your proposal. Take care and Happy New Year.